Kenny's a retired police officer, detective sergeant, who began his career in Petersburg and retired from the Hopewell Police Department. He is also a professional photographer as well as an avid lover of history. I think you'll find that out real fast. Kenny belongs to several historical heritage groups that include the Jamestown Society, Sons and Daughters of the Founding Fathers of Virginia, Sons of the American Revolution, Sons of the Union Veterans, Sons of the Confederate Veterans, and the Military Order of Stars and Stripes. Stars and Bars, excuse me. He'll get more. Kenny belongs to several local historical societies in which he holds a variety of offices. Kenny is currently the president of the Petersburg Civil War Roundtable, and he's also the president of the newly established Breakthrough Battlefield Foundation. Kenny is first past commander of the Virginia Division Sons of the Confederate Veterans, as well as commander of the Sons of Confederate Veterans Camp 1813, Deering, Baragon in Colonial Heights. And I'm so excited for this. Most of you know I did not grow up in Hopewell. I moved here 13 years ago, I think it was, 14 years ago. And I've heard the thing, Broadway Landing, Broadway Landing. I still have trouble with A Village and B Village. And I won't have to tell you, I'm on the EDA, and they talk about A Village or B Village, and I go,
yes, sir.
okay, where's that?
I just came for the food.
So it's my pleasure.
I understand that.
Kenny, you ready to come up?
Yes, sir.
Let's give a hand for, give a great hand for Kenny. Let's put this back here.
Either way. Thank you so much. Good.
Oh, we learned it.
Can everyone hear me? Is this okay? Like this? Everybody's good in the back? Everybody's good in the front? Sound all right? Okay. How many in the room, well, thank you for having me today as well. How many in the room know where Broadway Landing is? Okay, and I take it probably most in the room or live here in Hopewell. I found out that a lot of people do not know where Broadway Landing is. To be specific, it's on the western part of town. It's Atwater Road. And I think most of you know where Atwater Road is, the soccer complex and the little park there on the corner. Well, that was the hub of a lot of activity, and that's what we're going to talk about today. As you can see on the map, up here, Broadway Landing, it's marked with a large red star. And in the early 2000s, this location became the target of a research project conducted by a high school student by Nick Bolash. And Nick just did a fantastic study of Broadway Landing. He really did, and I've incorporated a lot of his research into what I've also researched. He uncovered details about the men who called this town home for about 10 months during the siege of Petersburg. It's my objective to provide you with a better understanding of just how important this now unknown town is. In terms of the transportation, the ordnance, and communications during the siege, it rivaled the operations right down here at City Point. And City Point, at the time of the siege of Petersburg, was, you can't overstate how important it was in terms of supply, ordnance, and supporting the troops. In 1864, the Civil War, as we all know, was raging across the United States. The Union and Confederate forces settled in for a siege. The Confederates in the city and the Union troops around the city to the south and to the east. The Union set up numerous supply stations for offloading the siege ammunition. The best known supply depot was located where? City Point, Virginia. In fact, City Point, Virginia was the busiest harbor center in the entire world at that time, from about June of 1864 until March of 1865. This bustling little town, Broadway Landing, of course at that time it was a part of Prince George. It wasn't a proper part of Hopewell or City Point at that point. But it was really, really busy out there. It had 8 buildings, 1 church, and it was the largest town in Prince George County at the time of the war. The history of Broadway Landing soon began after the establishment of the Virginia colony. It goes way back. And it also extended kind of just around the corner of a little bit there of where the Anchor Point Marina is as well. A number of settlers who lived further east explored down the James River and in 1619 established Bermuda Hundred. It's likely that these settlers were the first Europeans to take foot or to place a foot on this land. Late in the 17th century, a man by the name of Thomas Broadway moved to the area and named the land along the Appomattox River after himself. It's quite possible that the town he established consisted of no more than a few homes and the church. The 18th century really was the peak time for Broadway Landing. And when I say 18th century, of course, that's the 1700s. It became the largest town in Prince George, and in 1753 it was incorporated. This began a long tradition of Broadway Landing as a major transportation center for the area south of the capital of Richmond. When the Revolutionary War came about, the British used Broadway Landing as a base for their preliminary attacks on Richmond during the 1781 campaign. On this map, it depicts the route of General Cornwallis in red, and Broadway Landing is noted with a star. After the victory by the American colonies, the Appomattox River rose in importance because of the emergence of the nearby town of Petersburg as the most important regional center of commerce. The channel of the Appomattox River was made deeper up to Broadway Landing and in 1788 by an act of the Virginia legislature. Until the river was dredged a bit further, Broadway Landing became the official port of Petersburg. 1780, William Gilliam, a Broadway Landing resident, is mentioned in an act of the Virginia Legislature House. The Gilliams were a family that would continue to live in Broadway Landing even past the Civil War. The source in 1780s is the first time a resident of Broadway Landing is mentioned by name in a written source. Around the turn of the 19th century, a church was reported by a traveler passing through Broadway. And this church solidified Broadway Landing as a major center of Prince George County. The town of Broadway Landing continued as an important center of commerce with the construction of the Munt brick plant. Has anyone heard of the Munt brick plant? One genie in the back? Yep. Their business came to an end around 1830, and the Munt brick plant was right down where the Anchor Point Marina is now, kind of off on the corner there, the left corner, close to the river. After that, they sort of started to decline a little bit. Before the 1860 census, the only other mention of the town is on the 1855 map of the Appomattox River, pictured here, which shows a few buildings up on the bluff above the river. And you can see that as depicted there by the star, and that's the 6 little houses. The 1860 census reported Prince George County as having about 8,400 people, 4,900 of them being slaves and 2,900 whites and 515 free blacks. None of these people could have understood that in 4 short years, this country, along with Broadway Landing, would become the center of a heated conflict. The citizens of the now small village, the shots fired at Bull Run, Antietam, and Gettysburg may as well have been 1,000 miles away. It really had nothing to do with what was going on here at that time. General McClellan's Peninsula Campaign changed all notions that the developing battlefields were of no threat. After leaving the peninsula, Union troops had passed within 15 miles of Broadway Landing. There was no doubt that the townsfolk of Broadway Landing could hear some of the gunfire echoing across the James River. 1862, Broadway Landing was listed as an important riverfront town in Prince George, containing a church and 5 inhabited buildings, one of which was owned by Reuben Gilliam. As you can see from this listing, excuse me, I'm just battling a terrible chest cold. There were a number of free blacks in Prince George whose residence is listed as near Broadway, and that was in 1836. Also living in Broadway Landings in the 1860s was an Edward Finney, James Richards, William Richards, and Granderton Keys. I love that name, Granderton Keys. The town was small in size, although there was a lot of open land around it. Think about current day out towards the Federal Reformatory and the fields across from it, extending on out River Road towards Fort Lee. According to the 1862 land tax records, there were $325 worth of buildings, and it was paid for through land taxes. Within 2 years of the land tax in 1862, everyday life of every citizen living of Broadway Landing would change as Union troops would enter the town and make it into a place and that actually it would signal the death knell of the Confederacy. After 3 years of devastating conflict, the Union Army was frustrated in their repeated attempts to take the southern capital of Richmond. They had over twice the number of troops that the Confederacy had, but the problem lay in their leadership. Their generals were poor, very poor. In May of 1864, that changed. General Grant assumed the strategy of taking Richmond at all cost. His two-part strategy included winning battles to the north and the east of Richmond, while also sending a group of infantry under General Benjamin Butler. I think most of you have probably heard of General Butler, Beast Butler they called him. And he didn't do too well. He went up against Lee and suffered huge losses, 3 consecutive major ones at Spotsylvania, North Anna, and Cold Harbor. Grant decided to follow Butler across the James River and ultimately capture the one major stronghold and transportation hub that kept the Army of Northern Virginia alive, and that was Petersburg. Petersburg at that time was the second largest city in Virginia, and it was key. It had all types of railroad, it was a railroad hub, you had the river transportation. Although the Bermuda Hundred campaign yielded very few positive results, it was the first time that fighting in the war had literally been pushed to Broadway Landing's doorstep. Butler's campaign in the Bermuda Hundred had been costly and had accomplished very little. Besides the first death at Broadway Landing, which was a soldier by the name of William Carroll, he drowned there. There was not much action at that point at the landing. First came the only Confederate source detailing an event at Broadway Landing, coming from General P.G.T. Beauregard. He reported May 30th, 1864, there had been Union troops hastily withdrawing from the town. These were probably the last elements of Butler's army escaping and crossing there at Broadway Landing. 10 days later, Union soldiers led by General Gilmore crossed the river here, supposedly over a pontoon bridge. Other sources quote the bridge as being built about a month later. The final raids which took place at Broadway Landing were conducted by Cavalry Commander Wilson Kautz, who I think most Civil War buffs know who Wilson Kautz is. And he conducted 3 raids in the month of June in the Bermuda Hundred area. His June 22nd raid attacked Confederate positions in Bermuda Hundred and around Petersburg. The raids were an important step in completing the road to the siege that would soon come. Within a few days, Broadway would become the home to one of the most massive supply depots in history. The map that you see pictured here from the official Civil War Atlas is one of the early raids in Southern Virginia documents that documents these raids. This is sort of a familiar picture. The Library of Congress has it. That's right at the end of Atwater Road. If you go to Miss Atwater's property right there where it dead ends, there's a hill that overlooks the river. And if you go to the top of the hill, that's what you would have seen in 1864. There was one wharf that they constructed there, and it went on to become 3 wharfs. There was a laboratory, and if you look right here, that's the roof of the laboratory, and that's where they constructed the big 30-pound Parrott artillery shells, etc. And in fact, that picture was taken by Matthew Brady, and I'm sure we all know who Matthew Brady is. And he wrote, Colonel Abbott wrote, and we're going to talk a little bit more about Colonel Abbott in a moment, but he wrote, I have a laboratory on my wharf, and I'm filling 500 cartridges a day with any other work required to be done also handled. It was becoming apparent to both armies that this war was going to go on for a while and it wasn't going to be a quick ending. General Lee has settled in at Petersburg, and the Union Army here at City Point extending out towards Broadway. And again, all of these photos that you're seeing, in fact, I think it's all of them, it's Broadway Landing, most of it right down there at the river. By the end of June of 1864, it was assured that a major conflict was about to happen, and the last remaining Confederate citadel protecting Richmond, that was Petersburg, and that the Union Army and the Confederate Army were going to knock heads in there. The most important and the largest was the sprawling City Point complex at the confluence of the James and the Appomattox River. Broadway Landing was chosen as a site for a supply depot because of the depth of the water. It was very deep there, and most people, if you know anything too much about history, know that City Point was huge during the Civil War. It was a major thing. Most people aren't aware that Broadway Landing was just about equally important. The most important regiment stationed at the depot was the 1st Connecticut Heavy Artillery, a division with a great deal of distinguished combat experience. And we're going to talk a little bit more about the 1st Connecticut Heavy Artillery and Colonel Abbott. These epaulets down here on the table, I'm standing directly behind them, the gold epaulets that go up here on the uniforms, those belong to him. And he was a very key figure in the Civil War. June 26, 1864, at headquarters of this division was established at Broadway, and a commander was appointed. The commander was Colonel Henry L. Abbott. He went on to become a general a little bit later. He was a very capable commander who led Broadway through its entire tenure as a siege depot. Upon assuming command, Colonel Abbott wrote in his official report, July 11, 1864, my headquarters are at this landing where I have 2 wharfs. See, they had added a wharf at that point, and room for more if required, and they added a 3rd one later. 50 wagons placed at my disposal, 4 8-horse artillery teams in my command as the commander of the siege artillery of General Butler's army. It was a telegraph headquarters as well. Later in the campaign, Colonel Abbott, who was an engineer, would be promoted to the position of Chief of the Army Corps of Engineers. He had a hand in many of the major Army construction projects during the Petersburg campaign. Under Abbott's watch, Broadway Landing would soon become a sleek, streamlined supply depot. That's one of my favorite photos there. Colonel Abbott established a field hospital right there at Broadway Landing, aka Atwater Road, and these are some of his field surgeons. And that photo was taken in 1864 right there on Atwater Road. And he felt that this special hospital was needed out there as sort of a halfway point. rather, 3 miles to us. It's about 3 miles from Broadway Landing to City Point, which, seconds in a car today, but that was a little bit of a trip, and he wanted a place out on the west end for the soldiers that were wounded. And these are Army surgeons that are shown there, 4th Division, 9th Corps, and this photo was taken in July 1864. Next up are a couple of my favorite items, and they're here on the table in front of you. It's the only items I have ever found that are marked Broadway Landing. The only thing ever. And what they are hospital steward slates, where the guys would go around, the hospital stewards would go around, check on the patients, enter their names and what was going on with them, and their ward number. There's a large one and then there's a smaller one, and the same person, you can easily see the handwriting up here. That was scratched in by the same person. And you say, well, how did you get them? Well, when they disassembled the hospital at the conclusion of the war, long story short, is these slates wound up in Maine, and a little boy used them in school for a while. And he scratched his name in the back, and through doing that, I traced him to his grandfather, who was a steward there at the hospital. So it's just funny it worked out, but that's the only thing I've ever seen marked Broadway Landing. Colonel Abbott, right there. Anybody know what monstrous cannon that is?
Dictator.
Absolutely, the dictator. Colonel Abbott commanded the Union siege during the siege of Petersburg, operating heavy artillery, including the Dictator, which is a massive 13-inch Seacoast mortar. Mounted on a railroad flat car, the 17,000-pound weapon fired 220-pound shells directly into the Confederate lines in the city of Petersburg. And this is the same Colonel Abbott that's right here on Broadway Landing. Abbott and his command, which was primarily Company G of the 1st Connecticut Heavy Artillery, brought the weapon up on the City Point and Petersburg Railroad in July of 1864. He directed the mortar's fire with the primary goal of neutralizing the Confederates' Chesterfield Battery, which was inflicting heavy damage on Union positions across the Appomattox River. Abbott's forces kept a heavy piece in operation for about 90 days, about 3 months, during which time it fired 218 rounds into the heavily fortified Confederate position. Who you see here is Private Homer Stone, Company E, 4th Massachusetts Cavalry, enlisted 1864. He was among the earliest deaths at Broadway Landing. He died of typhoid. And he's buried in Berlin, Massachusetts. A couple of other soldiers I researched who also died there was a Private Stephen Abbott, enlisted at age 26, died of disease, and he's buried right over here at the top end of 10th Street at the National Cemetery here in Hopewell. Private Thomas Armstrong, age 18, also died of disease. He's buried in the City Point National Cemetery. And Sergeant Jacob Carson, also buried City Point National Cemetery. This is the flat part right at the base of the hill there. At the dead end, you go to the dead end of Atwater Road, and you've got the bluff overlooking the river, and it slopes down and it winds up on a beach. It was a very busy place, as you can see there. You see some 30-pound Parrott guns, Coehorn mortars there. Some of this is believed to have been taken from the fort over in Colonial Heights, Fort Clifton, right there at the end. I don't know if that's true or not, or if that's just some more of their own supplies, but that shows you part of what was right there at the base of the hill on Atwater Road. And you can see a little bit, that's the high-tech lab. In some photos you'll see canvas over it, providing a roof, but not in this particular one. Broadway Landing served as the western edge of the waterborne siege depot because the Appomattox River channel was especially deep there. It was able to accommodate, as you can see here, larger vessels. Also significant in this picture is Cobb's Hill. Yeah, circled up there, Cobb's Hill, which was a Union signal station right across the river. Or as they call it now, the Chesterfield side of the river. The signal tower at Cobb's Hill was situated above Pointerax. The tower offered unparalleled views of the Confederate lines, the Appomattox River, and the city of Petersburg. They used flags, torches, and lights of almost every kind to transmit encrypted messages via combinations of motions. And that photo is by Timothy O'Sullivan. That's another picture of the ordnance there, right at the top end, the north end of Atwater Road. In all, 1,200 tons, imagine that, 1,200 tons of ammunition passed through Broadway in July of 1864, although it was not as big of a contributor of arms as City Point. Of course, City Point was the big dog at that time. All in all, Broadway Landing served as an excellent supply depot because in a short time, goods could be transported from the landing to almost any point of the battlefield. From Bermuda Hundred to Five Forks, Union troops could seek solace in the fact that they had the dependability of a smooth-running supply depot behind them and the lines at Broadway Landing. This is a photo here of the pontoon bridge. In fact, I brought this in today. This is an actual original photo of the pontoon bridge taken at that time. In addition to everything we've talked about so far, another important purpose of Broadway Landing was it was a transportation center. When it was created, the landing had 50 wagons that were sent with supplies all over the battlefield. If someone needed to travel in the general area of Broadway, it was the place to go when someone needed a ride. The wagons were laid next to the wharves on the riverbank for both supply and transportation use. Broadway's most important transportation application came from its pontoon bridge across the Appomattox River. And you can see the pontoons, if you look, supporting that bridge. A great deal of Union traffic flowed through it. Another pontoon bridge at Pointerax was built about September 19, 1864. And as an illustration of the proof of the proficiency of the Union engineers, which was led by Colonel Abbott, it was built with 23 boats in 1 hour and 15 minutes. That is absolutely stunning. An hour and 20 minutes to put up something that big. The Pointerax Bridge does not carry as much traffic as the one at Broadway because of enemy snipers. The Confederate Army sent snipers in the bluffs above it and would pick off the Union Army. Fort Converse was occupied at that time, and Fort Converse is out there closer, a little bit closer to the Federal Reformatory. And it was constructed by Confederate forces at Fort Spring Hill, but was captured and renamed Fort Converse by the Union troops. And that Fort Converse provided a lot of protection in there from that sniping that was going on. The bridges, as you can see, could carry a limited amount of weight, and they were really sturdy, and they had all kinds of troops and horses and artillery, etc., going across. However, on September 30th, 1864, an excessively heavy cannon just broke through it, so they had to effect repairs there. And in fact, the pylons, I believe, are still visible down there. Last time I was down there, they were. Again, the river right there at the bottom of Atwater Road. It also served, Broadway Landing, in addition to what we've talked about, it also served as a defensive center. And we know of some of these little forts here and there that protected the main target, which would have been City Point. The one that I don't know if they still call it Fort Abbott anymore over here on Broadway. On 15th, there was a string of small forts, again, for defensive purposes. Broadway was the center of major communication lines that housed a telegraph depot, which connected General Butler's troops in Bermuda Hundred with City Point, and City Point with the western battlefields. It had to be guarded with utmost care. When the telegraph office would break down, as it did in March of 1865, it could turn out to be disastrous. Although no known battles took place precisely on Broadway Landing, there were skirmishes all around it. At Port Walthall, Bayless Farm, and a number of homes in the area, shots were exchanged and men were killed. By the end of July 1864, 32 men had been killed and 107 had been wounded. Grant knew that the Broadway Landing was very important to his war effort, and he ordered it fortified. Grant was serious about protecting his interests. Much was put into defending this pontoon bridge. Spring Hill Fort was built expressly to stop the snipers. Even with all the nearby carnage, Broadway Landing still had another type of challenge to face protecting the Appomattox River. Grant had already laid mines in places at the river, but it was not enough to stop crafty Confederate ironclad commanders. These attacks became increasingly frequent along the river, the James River, and the Appomattox as the Confederate positions became more dire. The final act of desperation came January 30th, 1865. A letter written by a Union soldier, and it was written rather graphically, details the attack of a Confederate ironclad, which we see here, down the Appomattox River. It advanced as far as Broadway Landing, where it was forced to turn due to a hail of gunfire from Union gunboats. That was pretty much the last major offensive that the Confederate Army made against Broadway Landing, too. Although Broadway Landing was doing its job admirably, it was about time to call it to an end. The siege depot of the Union Army exploited the enormous advantages of the Union that they had in their supplies, and after 10 months, the Confederates were wearing down. Abbott returned from 2-month hiatus in North Carolina, and in March of 1865 to a situation that was vastly different from the one he had left. There were no more sniping going on, and basically it had settled down there at Broadway Landing finally. Soon the Union Army had surrounded Petersburg, and after 10 months of hard fighting, Union soldiers broke through and took the town. The same date that Richmond was captured by Union troops, April 2nd, 1865. And at that point, the siege depot at Broadway Landing basically ended its operation. Because of that, the landing was no longer needed. The troops cleared out of Broadway, and the last troops leaving May 1st, 1865 for Drury's Bluff. As a last act as commander of Broadway Landing, Colonel Abbott asked Grant to keep the pontoon bridge in place at the landings there at the foot of the hill, and that was to be used like a gift to the town people there. However, Grant must have refused because there's an 1867 map of the area and it does not show the pontoon bridge. Some think that Abbott used the church for his own purpose, and after the war it was no longer a church. Others think it was destroyed. The answer for sure is not yet known. With the end of the war came the end of an era. Never again would a siege depot be used in the United States next to a battlefield. With the war over, the town prepared to welcome back its long-gone citizens. By 1935, Broadway Landing had completely disappeared. It is located beneath what is now Atwater Road in Hopewell. I've got a few objects up here that tie into this. With the hospital, there's a surgeon's kit here. There's some splints that were used. There's a medical officer's kepi, Colonel Abbott's epaulets, some syringes. This is kind of interesting too. You look at it and you say, well, that's a canteen, which it is. It can be used as a canteen, but the hospital there would put hot water in it and you put it on your kidney. So that's kind of ingenious. Some of it is some pretty, by medical standards, it's some pretty gruesome items. If you had a tooth go bad, well, you can take her right on out. Excessive pressure on your head. This is a tree pine. There's a handle in here that goes at the top, and we just bore a hole in your head. And they made these in various sizes. If you got a bad arm, bad leg, we can take care of that too. Facial surgery. I think there's a little more work there to be done. And there's some other associated items there, but would anyone have any questions or anything like that? Another thing I would throw out there, down on Pierce Street, 1000 block of Pierce Street, 1011 Pierce Street to be exact, here in the city, down in City Point, is a small church graveyard. Now, I own that graveyard. There's 31 graves in it. There's 3 Civil War soldiers there. There's 9 children. There's riverboat captains, etc., etc. And on that site, there was a small Methodist church, Trinity, which is now up here at 6th and Broadway. It burned in a fire in 1937. And the last person to be buried there was 1935. If anyone would have any information or photos, I would sure like to see them. I've got a couple pictures of the church, but that's about it. It burned to the ground, and the only thing that came out of it was part of the pulpit, similar to what I'm standing at, and the Bible laid open to the next day's service, pretty much undamaged. So I'm digging into that right now, and also I have a presentation on City Point, which is a bit more involved than this one because of what was going on there. So think about that as well. I'm very interested in Hopewell history, City Point, Broadway Landing. But again, would anyone have any questions about the items or Broadway Landing at all? Yes, sir.
Kenny, thanks for the presentation. What's there now? I've never actually been out there. Can you access where it was, private property, houses, or anything like that? Or you said you were out there somewhere. Where do you park, etc.?
If you leave Hopewell, Tom, by I call it the back way, you go out River Road. The last street on your right, heading towards Petersburg, is Atwater Road, the hockey fields, etc. there. Turn on Atwater, go to the dead end, and that's Miss Atwater's property. So yes, it is private property there. It's probably best seen from the river. You really get a better view of the bluffs going up above it. There's so much history there, extending way earlier than the Civil War. Yes, sir.
Maybe just as a reference, all the pictures of the ordnance, the cannons and things that you've seen on the ground, that is actually the parking lot at the boat landing.
Yeah, yes.
So he gives you, when you drive to that boat landing down there, you're driving across where you saw all those cannons laying on the ground.
Yeah, that whole area, The landing, George, that you're talking about, it extends right around the corner. Here's the landing, and right here is Broadway. All of it is Broadway Landing, yes. And it extends on up west towards the Federal Reformatory, where there's a grave marker, by the way. Anyone else have any? Yes, sir.
I have two brief questions. One is, not about Broadway Landing, Weston Manor. I mean, 6 Point. Isn't that where Lincoln came after the Civil War and he went to Petersburg?
Yes, Lincoln came in the last 3 weeks of Lincoln's life. 2 of them were spent at City Point, where he came down primarily to meet with Grant, Sheridan, Sherman, and to visit the soldiers that were in the hospital. Security was so tight at that point that Tad Lincoln, who was with him on the first part of it, he couldn't even access the docks. That's because August 9th, 1864, the explosion, it was Confederate espionage, and that was one of the most spectacular events of the entire Civil War. One man walked in there by himself and pretty much took out City Point.
And that was Prince George there, right? Right.
Yes.
So he didn't come to Hopewell, he came to Prince George.
Well, Hopewell came in about 1915. So yeah, at this time, City Point was a sleepy little village of maybe 300 people.
And the other question, when I heard, from a small arms caliber standpoint, I heard that the Union troops used about either 30 or 46 caliber, and it's the other way around. The Confederates used a smaller caliber for their small arms than the Union. So after a battle, the Union troops would come in and get all their mini balls off the dead Confederates because they were fitting their rifles. Do you know if that's true?
There was a lot of exchanging, I guess you could call it, of equipment to include rifles, sidearms, mini balls. In fact, the massive explosion there at City Point, I've got a lot of items that came out of the river, including ammunition. I've got an ammunition box that was underwater. It's wood. It was underwater for over 150 years, and it's usable today. And that's because it was in the silt and the mud and the water, and low oxygen deprivation will preserve items in many cases. But yeah, there was a lot of that taken back and forth of equipment and arms and so forth. Yes, sir.
I've been a local diver for 52 years, and I dive for underwater archaeology on numerous projects. Did I understand you to say that they were transporting a cannon across that one of those docks and it broke and fell in?
Yes, that came out.
I was looking for a new project.
Yeah, that, well, if you're looking for projects as far as items underwater, and that, to my knowledge, the cannon didn't go in the water, but it heavily damaged the pontoon bridge.
Okay.
Where what really happened was right down where the docks are today at City Point. Of course, the Union Army utilized that whole area to occlude around the point behind Appomattox Manor. And I can't tell you how many tons of ordnance went in during that explosion.
I understand it's all federally protected.
That's my understanding as well, so don't go get in the river. Yep. Yep.
You better know the law in this day.
You bet. You bet.
That's the 2 guys that dove on Minnesota.
Yeah. Yep. Yeah, you don't want to do that. That's, yes, sir, way in the back.
Yes,
You're right.
in 1864, in May of 1864, Grant was frustrated by Lee's fortifications around Richmond, so he decided to go off the Lee's left and cross the James River. At that time, he built a pontoon bridge across the James River. Was the same that people who built that pontoon bridge built a pontoon bridge at Broadway?
The engineering corps constructed all of them. That's a different bridge, and you're exactly right. In May of '64, he actually slipped around on Lee and got in there without Lee's knowledge. Over that general direction too, the Union Army had about 5,000 head of cattle over there that, of course, they used it to eat. I'm sure most people in here have heard of the beefsteak raid, but that's a whole nother story. But yeah, there was a lot of bridge building, and they got to be very, very good at it. Same thing with the hospitals here. They started out the war pretty crude, but before it was over with, they actually had advanced and made some remarkable progress in medicine. And some of these instruments, I don't think I'd want them working on me like that tree fine hole maker there, but some of the syringes that are up here. But yeah, it was a time of learning as well. Yes, sir, there was another question somewhere back that same general area, I thought. Yes, ma'am.
Did the citizens of Petersburg attempt to renovate the area after the Union Army, etc., moved out and use it for private commerce?
You're talking about the city of Petersburg in whole?
Well, the citizens, you said they came back, of course, after the armies left. But since that's such a good, or at least I would think, a good area for commerce, did they try to privatize it?
Well, I wasn't referring to Petersburg. I was referring to Broadway Landing. And what you mentioned is, to me, one of the biggest mysteries of all. After the Civil War, you just cannot find hardly anything about Broadway Landing. I've gotten with Jeannie. I've gotten with the lady out at the Prince George Historical. Why they're using 1935 as a cutoff date, I don't know. But it's like it just disappeared, and that's part of the title of this, is Broadway Landing Brought Out of the Shadows. I'm sure a lot of folks in here are longtime Hopewell citizens, and I am as well, and I live on Broadway Landing, and there a lot of years went by. I never knew any of this. Not a bit of it. All right. No further questions. Thank you so much for having me here, and feel free to come up and look at the table.